Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. As nonprofit leadership is increasingly under the microscope when it comes to public trust, transparency, accountability, and particularly in light of recent high-profile revelations about organizations such as Hockey Canada and We Charity, and as the sector grapples with a lack of diversity at the leadership level, we ask, is it time for a leadership refresh? Joining me to discuss these important issues is Matt Fullbrook. Matt has advised over 250 boardrooms during his 20-year career as a corporate governance researcher, educator, and consultant. He's also the host of the 1 Minute Governance podcast, creator of Ground Up Governance, and a frequent speaker and media commentator. Welcome, Matt.
Hey, Mary. Thanks for having me.
So, we've heard from multiple reports that have been published that there's an indication of a worrisome decline in public trust of nonprofit and charitable organizations over the past decade. Does this surprise you? And do you have any thoughts on why this trend might be occurring?
Yeah, I don't want to be too specific or overstate my expertise in the sort of macro economy, but I think that we can kind of tie together the decreasing trust in the charitable sector and the decreasing trust in the sort of capitalist model in general, because the charitable sector exists as part of the capitalist economy, and I'm not here to criticize that model, but I think that we can make an assumption that as trust erodes, generally speaking, in our economic models and approaches to how people make and spend money and so on, that charities are going to feel some of those effects as well. So I think that this is less about the behaviors of individual organizations and more, I suspect, a more macro trend.
Well, yes, but there certainly have been some high-profile scandals, such as Charity and Hockey Canada, and certainly it did involve, impacts on the governance of the organization, or it came from problems with the governance of these organizations. Does this continue to erode this kind of trust?
I think that to the extent that those headlines get a lot of attention, and there's, as we know, a general negativity bias in the way that coverage of every sort of newsworthy topic happens, I think that matters, right? Because those pieces are going to be front and center to the consumers of that information, and it's possible that some people will make those connections. I struggle to imagine. I'm putting myself in the position of a leader or a board member or even a donor or a volunteer of any particular organization that's trying to do good work. And if my community had doubts about my organization as a result of a scandal that happened in a completely different organization, that to me doesn't seem all that difficult to try to repair. And I think if we are really clear about our purpose and how the work that we're doing in service of our mission and vision, and the intentions that we have to empower or improve the lives of our communities, and this is not at all to diminish the absolute failures at We and at Hockey Canada, which are really dramatic failures. I think in most cases, even if there's a little bit of sort of collateral damage, I think that's repairable on an individual organizational basis.
Well, I guess a fair question is to follow up to say, well, how? Because if we can assume that it did impact trust of the public generally, these are very large and important organizations, and therefore would have more resources than a lot of smaller charities. I mean, if it can impact the trust that the public has in these organizations, and there's a kind of spill-on effect to smaller organizations, what can they do to, I guess, win the confidence back of the public?
Yeah, I think, if we take the sort of most obvious example, I don't think, for example, it's impossible for We and for Hockey Canada to repair the to the trust in their organizations if they're doing the work and doing it transparently and doing it obviously and doing it sincerely and communicating clearly and emphasizing good leadership and good governance and ultimately having the positive impact in the world that they want to have. So if it's possible for them to repair things, and obviously they have to do it sincerely and without trying to make it some sort of PR stunt, right? They have to play the long game and actually repair the trust and do the good work. The proof is going to be in, is our purpose, our stated purpose, relevant to the people we serve? Are we clearly deploying services and products and so on that are in service of that purpose? Are we doing it in a way that appears to be responsible in terms of how we're investing our time and money and human capital and so on? And I think that story is really powerful. I'm not even expecting everybody to be a communications and PR expert. I think that it really does show your community the value that you have if you're being very clear about your purpose and how you're delivering on it. So I'm not trying to trivialize the question. I really do believe that a rising tide lifts all boats, and the opposite is probably true to a certain extent as well. But I want to emphasize that the leaders of individual organizations do control their destiny more than the system does.
Well, as a governance expert, can you shed some light on the board's role in promoting trust? So certainly we know that CEOs and executive directors of organizations have a very important role to play, but of course there's the role of the board that is critical as well. Could you sort of expand on their role in promoting trust and setting policies that create that trust and that transparency?
Yeah, on the one hand, it's hard to overstate the role in the sense that ultimately the board is responsible for everything, right? They're the ones whose butts are on the line. The CEOs and executive directors that you mentioned only have authority because the board made a decision to delegate authority to them. But ultimately, the board is the one who's responsible for all that behavior, including transparency. So there's no, just to use a silly example, if there's a crisis as a result of a lack of transparency, the board can't say it's not our fault, because it is, right? Everything that happens is ultimately the board's fault, and ultimately they're accountable for it. So in that sense, you can't overstate it. In a more sort of realistic sense, there's the answer comes from an ongoing set of decisions, right? I don't think a healthy organization will thrive under set it and forget it conditions. You don't make a decision that, okay, we're going to communicate in this way today and it's going to be like that forever and it's going to work great. What I think is a more healthy approach to it is to say, okay, this is what, based on the conditions that we understand, these are the decisions we're going to make in terms of how we're going to communicate to our stakeholders and to the public. And we're going to monitor that. And we're going to be really intentional about, is this working? What does working even mean? How are we communicating or getting information and feedback back from those stakeholders so that we can adjust and optimize this on an ongoing basis? And I think that the typical failure is to assume that a decision that we made at time zero is going to be relevant forever. And obviously that's not true. And I'm not even just saying in times of crisis. I think it can be really important to reflect on and review your approaches to communication with your stakeholders constantly, just because you're curious about whether it's working or not, let alone you want to avoid some kind of disaster.
Do you think that, obviously, Canada is made up of not just the big players in the nonprofit sector, but also a lot of small charities and nonprofits that have, in most cases, volunteer boards that are giving of their own time and sometimes expertise. But in any case, do you think that there's an understanding among board members of the actual sort of awesome responsibility that they're carrying under these circumstances?
I'm going to be careful not to paint everybody with the same brush. Maybe I'll answer your question or a slightly different question, which is, if we zoom out and think about it, there's not really any single reliable resource available to directors, whether they're new or experienced, that answers the question, what am I actually supposed to be doing, right? And how do I know if I'm doing it well? there's tons of resources out there that have the headline of governance or boards or whatever terminology you like to use. And I've done this recently, trying to find what's out in the world that answers the question, what is governance? What is good governance? And to be completely candid with you, there's not much. And the stuff that is there is typically really confusing, or if you read three things, they all contradict each other. And so I think what I'm saying is I'm trying to be empathetic to the directors out there who are in the room and hoping to do a great job, but aren't 100% clear what that means. And I don't think that there's an easy solution, but the first step is putting up your hand if you're not 100% clear and saying, hey, guys, just FYI, I've been thinking about it, and I'm not 100% sure that I have a clear concept of what good governance is. What about you? And if the other people in the room aren't sure either, then to me, that's a signal that says, why don't we, if we can't find a definition or a model out there that resonates with us, let's create something so that when we walk in the room tomorrow, we, exactly as you say, we have a sense of this awesome responsibility, but also we've got some shared path that we're traveling together to deploy that responsibility with I mean, I don't want to overstate it. There's no such thing as optimal, right? This is a journey rather than a destination, but with that, we're traveling that path with eyes wide open and with a sincere commitment to good governance. And I think this is a tricky problem, but I'll answer your question more directly. I guess now is, I think there is a really big problem. Most board members, and this is not unique to charities, most board members in any organization will struggle to say out loud, confidently and clearly, I know what my job is, and here's how I'm going to go and do it well the next time I walk into a boardroom. That is a very challenging, very large problem, and one that it's only occurred to me in the last year or so of my long career that I can play a role in hopefully trying to solve or address.
Well, I guess as a sort of a subsidiary point on this, we know from the Statistics Canada report that was published a couple of years ago that a lack of diversity continues to be a problem at the board level for Canadian nonprofits. How does this impact decisions made at the board level? And does it relate to this question of governance? Do you think it factors into some of these issues we see around public trust?
Yeah, so now you're speaking my language pretty directly, Mary, in a lot of ways. So I'm not going to try to sell you on my definitions. I'm just going to share them with you so that you know what I mean when I'm using this language. I define governance or corporate governance, meaning governance in any incorporated entity. I don't think it's unique to for-profit organizations. So I define corporate governance as the way that decisions get made in an incorporated entity. So the sum of all of the decisions that happen in an organization, that's governance. Whether those decisions happen intentionally or by accident, whether it's the board or people on the front lines or whatever, that's all governance. Good governance, I think of as intentionally cultivating effective conditions for making decisions. So we have control as an organization, especially leaders of an organization. We have control over a lot of the conditions, whether it's who's in the room, how we share information, the timing and cadence of the decision making, the layout of the boardroom, everything, all these conditions matter. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey here, but I hope you understand when I get to the end of it, what I'm getting at. If anyone listening likes that definition of good governance as intentionally cultivating effective conditions for making decisions, let's think about equity, diversity, and inclusion for a second. Diversity is bringing multiple and divergent perspectives to bear so that they can be included in a decision. Inclusion is creating conditions where those multiple and divergent perspectives can actually be voiced safely and heard and understood. And equity is the result, where all of those people involved in that decision have an equal opportunity to influence it. I would argue that what I just described is almost exactly the same as intentionally cultivating effective conditions for making decisions. So To the extent that I'm right, that means equity, diversity, and inclusion and good governance are the same thing. And a failure to bring multiple and divergent perspectives to bear in the boardroom is a failure to do the first most achievable step of good governance, which is diversity. And the failure is so persistent and so extensive and so awful. And the gatekeepers who are presenting barriers to this happening, who continue to seem to be looking for some elusive business case. Well, that's the business case. You don't have good governance without diversity and equity, or sorry, diversity and inclusion, which results in equity. So I'm on a bit of a rant here, but the board diversity is the number 1, 2, and 3 most commonly talked about issue in governance in my 20 plus years in the space. And frankly, it's not getting better, right? Some of the conversations are getting a little bit more sophisticated. There's a much more reputable industry of advice and resources that are available to boards and executives and so on. But the problem persists in an extremely awful way. And so the short version of that argument is, without it, there's no such thing as good governance.
And so what can boards do to address this lack of diversity? Like, how would you advise a board to go about it, assuming that they wanted to have a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable board? How would you suggest that they go about it?
Yeah, so I'm going to use a generic example first and then zoom in a little bit. One of the most common calls I get this is usually board chairs, sometimes CEOs. They will say to me, there's some people on my board who just never talk, no matter what we do. And my first response will be, well, tell me a little bit about those things that you've done to try to help to activate those voices. And usually, I'm being a little unfair, but not much. Usually they'll say, well, I make sure to give them a chance to speak, meaning I point a finger at them and say, now's your turn to be spontaneously brilliant. And for some reason, they're not it still doesn't activate them. And this is to say that the most common complaint, second most maybe, is that we've got people in the room who aren't participating fully. The only thing that most boards try to do to solve that problem is to make those people feel less comfortable by pointing a finger at them. And if this is an indication of the depth and the sophistication of our efforts to create inclusive environments in boardrooms, then that's your first place that you need to make an adjustment. Because even if you change your recruitment efforts and you're able to attract diverse talent into the room, they won't feel welcome and they won't participate. And even if they do participate, they're not participating at the level that they could, because you're not investing in intentionally cultivating conditions for them to thrive. And the reality is, there's no one single set of conditions that's going to be optimally inclusive of an entire group of, let's say, 12 people at the same time. So we have to be constantly changing, trying new things, so that person number 1 can be activated, and then person number 2, and then person number 3 and 4, and so on. So I've said a lot of things here, but I feel very strongly that the norms or the conventions of a boardroom approaches have to change very dramatically, or else even if we start ticking the diversity box, the inclusion piece is going to elude us.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about an individual board member's responsibilities and their liability. So you did mention, of course, that that's enormous responsibility on boards, but how can collectively poor governance by an organization's board impact the directors personally? Maybe you could give a clearer picture for our listeners.
Yeah. So, I mean, what we're zeroing in here, if I'm understanding correctly, is a little bit of the kind of legal side of things. And I'll answer your question, but I don't want to overstate it, right? There is a significant accountability, and there's very rarely some very significant liability. And those things matter. And it matters, I would say, more philosophically than practically. But let's talk about the law piece of it for a second. The Canada Business Corporations Act lays out the duties of a director in a really strange way, frankly, which says, and I'm not going to get the vocabulary exactly right, but it says that a director has the duty to prioritize the interests of, quote unquote, the corporation, and to take into consideration the interests of stakeholders, for example, and then it lists shareholders and members and the environment and so on, but doesn't say, hey, your duty is, let's prioritize members, or let's prioritize donors, or let's prioritize the environment. It says you choose, basically. And so that does two things. It makes the job really kind of abstract, right? Because we have to walk in the room and say, wait, what exactly is our duty here? But I think the answer is that it kind of gives us a bit of a superpower. And here's where the accountability and liability thing comes into play. The way that I like to frame this is, when we come into the room as directors and we have especially a consequential decision at hand, I think it's really important to have an open and candid conversation about which groups and individuals in our community and beyond stand to be affected by our decision, positively or negatively. There's no such thing as a decision we can make as a board that's going to be good for everybody. It doesn't exist. But what we can ask is, who's going to be affected, who's going to win, who's going to suffer. Let's say it out loud, so that at the moment that we choose a path, we've done it with our eyes wide open and said, you know what, we know that this group or this individual is going to be harmed. We still made the decision that we did. And in almost every jurisdiction, just doing that, what we just talked about, and making sure that it's minuted and clear, is discharging your duties as a director. Now, if you don't do that, if you just sort of charge down a path without imagining the consequences, and it harms somebody and they choose to sue you, and you have no evidence that you even took them into consideration at all, that's where you're vulnerable, because they can look at it and say, well, they were negligent. I was affected by this. They had no idea. And here I am. And in those cases, and in some other cases, it's possible for a stakeholder to sue directors individually and for that director's personal assets to be at stake. That's very rare. And for the most part, the courts offer management and directors a significant amount of leeway to make decisions that they feel are best for the organization. But that's an example of a type of failure that could lead to a director being liable.
And so I guess I'd like to hear from your perspective and all the work that you've done over the years consulting with boards, what you would say to someone interested in joining a nonprofit board of directors for the first time. What do they need to know to be a successful director?
Oh, I have a very kind of countercultural opinion on this, to be honest. So you're listening to one voice that may not align well with many of my peers. I, in general, and I don't think this will surprise you given the definitions of corporate governance and good governance that I've offered, I don't think that what boards typically look for is what actually makes someone a good director. So if we look at a board will typically recruit based on someone's resume. Have they been on boards before? Have they had management positions? What's their position in our community? Do they have deep pockets so they can donate? Do they have a large community of deep pocketed people so they can cultivate new donations for us? All that stuff. That's all fine. I'm not saying reject that. What I am saying is none of that predicts whether someone is going to be able to intentionally cultivate effective conditions for making decisions, right? So it's fine to recruit based on those things, but it has nothing to do with good governance. So my answer directly to your question is, if I were someone who's never sat in a boardroom before, even someone who has, and I'm starting to think, what's next? Maybe I want to sit on a board or sit on another board, the first questions that I would ask myself would be, where am I going to feel like I really matter, and where the organization really matters to me? Because otherwise, what's the point? And then I would say, what steps can I take to get to know this organization well enough so that if and when I get the opportunity to walk into that room as a director, I understand what the current conditions are. I understand what I hope the conditions could be for making decisions, and I feel confident that I'm going to have an opportunity to express those things safely without, I'll be very polite here, without being criticized. But in extreme cases, the circumstances can be much more hostile than just criticism. So I think, and I'm going to generalize for the sake of making a point here. One of the worst reasons to get on a board is just because, quote unquote, I want to join boards now. I think it's, as we've talked about, the job is sufficiently serious and difficult and complicated, and with stakes not just personally but for the effectiveness of the organization, that why would you do it just to, quote unquote, be on a board? And the answer is usually just for status, or if it's in another sector, for money. And I would argue those are really bad reasons to join boards. I think it's much better to think of how you can be a part of making the organization and the people it serves better. And if you really believe that you can do that, and you feel confident that you are interested in helping to intentionally cultivate effective conditions for making decisions, then that's what should drive you. And if that's not for you, then being a director is not for you. That's completely fine.
So from your experience working with organizations, I'd love to know what you think some of the common things are that directors get wrong in the boardroom.
So I'm going to expand this a little bit, if that's okay, and say it's senior management too, because this is really a partnership. And frankly, I mentioned that the second most common call that I get, which is about directors not speaking up in the boardroom, the most common call I get is from CEOs saying, "Hey, Matt, I heard you're the board guy. My board is driving me crazy, and I don't know what to do about it." And the reality is, and this is something that's sometimes hard both for boards and CEOs or executive directors to embrace fully, is that CEOs, and I'll make it very clear, I believe CEOs have more influence over board effectiveness than the board does. And the reason I believe that is they are the board's source of information. They have a heavy hand in setting the agendas. They're the ones who design and deliver presentations. They deliver the conversation prompts after the presentations. The board is ultimately, and this is just only a little bit of an exaggeration, the board is ultimately just walking through the doors that senior management is opening for them. If the board walks in the room and they say, "We've read the material, we've listened to the presentation, you've asked us, does anybody have any questions?" and we're responding to that prompt. Now, I think there's a couple of different things here that answers your question. One, none of that is intentional, right? This is just us, all of us, board and management, just following the same routine we're used to without wondering what could be different, what could be better. That's the most common failure, is walking into the room assuming that things should be the way they always have been. And it's really important to understand that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say probably 90% of the stuff that happens in a boardroom is optional, and also not very good. So if 95% of what you do is optional and not very good, it is bizarre to me that there's not more experimentation. And so building on that, so I'm being general. I think this is a mutual failure between board and senior management. Building on that, I think that there's a very common failure, which is an assumption that there's such a thing as best practice. In other words, that we should be out there looking at other organizations and wondering what's the best thing that exists out there. My question, I know this is an annoying question, but I mean it sincerely. My question is, what if good hasn't been done yet? What if that's true? What if we could come up with something better than anyone else has ever done? And instead of looking out in the real world for best practice, which honestly, the real world is very steeped in convention and status quo. So you're going to struggle to find best practice. Instead, wonder, what are we trying to do here, right? What is what is our objective for this agenda item? And how can we approach this in a new way, even if it's only 1% different than last time, that'll to be a little bit better than it was before? And that's a very different approach to governance than what I typically see. And so the short version is, I think the failure, or the most common failure by board and management, is to stick with the status quo, even though nobody believes it's working very well. And I think that's a real problem.
Now, I was really struck by your description of the partnership that exists between the board and the CEO or the executive director. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about what boards can do better, for example, to get the kind of transparency that they need in order to make the decisions that are best informed and most effective under the circumstances. What kind of power do they have to require that, to increase the kind of transparency that they can gain in order to do a better job?
So you mean a transparency between board and management here?
Correct. I mean, you've described something that could potentially be putting the CEO or the executive director as a gatekeeper of the information that they just don't want the board to have. And so, or may prefer, it makes it easier for them if the board isn't aware of it. And I'm curious what kind of power the board has and recommendations to take that into consideration in terms of, I guess, being less passive and more purposeful in terms of making sure they're getting the information that they need.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer the question under the assumption that everybody's engaging in this process in good faith, right? So instead of assuming that the CEO is trying to hide something, instead, the more common set of circumstances would be that it's impossible to communicate everything. So the CEO will make decisions, or the executive team will make decisions about, okay, well, we think this is the best way we're going to communicate the most important stuff. And usually the board will not, and this is, I'm overgeneralizing, but I think you'll understand what I'm getting at. A lot of boards don't take the time to sort of take a step back and ask themselves, or have a conversation with management and say, you know what, I didn't really understand this part, or I felt like it was a little bit too long, or I didn't understand how the numbers and the words aligned with each other, or you know what, I found it way too long. I had time to read it, but I couldn't absorb everything because there's too much information. Or, you know, I'd really rather get this in a podcast form, or a video, or a drawing, or whatever it is. These, I think, are conversations that could happen and don't. And I think part of this is the status quo bias that I described before. And another part of it is, actually, it's really embarrassing to put up your hand and say, I didn't understand this. And even more embarrassing to try to have to endorse a decision based on incomplete information, or information that confused you, or whatever. And so this has to be a living, evolving compromise, because there's, as I said, there's no way to communicate everything. So I think it's important to start, and I hate to use the word routine, because that makes it feel like it's static and you do it the same way every time, but get used to having a conversation about the substance and content and timing and medium and so on of the information. And you can do it in a mundane way, just by saying, you know what, it would be really much better for me if this were laid out as so-and-so, or if you put it through a text-to-speech engine so that I could read it or listen to it, or whatever. But also in more substantial ways, like, you know, that last major decision that we had to make, I felt like we missed a few things as a result of the way the information was communicated to us. Next time, I'd really like to try this or that, or ABC, or I'd like management to come back to us and think about new ways to communicate, because we're struggling to engage at a forward-oriented level. We get stuck in the details. Whatever it is, say it out loud, because information asymmetry between board and management is a feature rather than a bug of the decision on the board's behalf to delegate to management. They're saying, look, we trust you to run the organization. You're going to know more than we do. That's a feature. That's great. That said, the board is ultimately responsible and accountable for the decisions, and the process of optimizing information flow, or optimizing makes it sound like there's an answer. The process of cultivating effective information flow has to be ongoing. Even if you change one person in the boardroom, they may suddenly, I'll exaggerate for the sake of making a point. What if that person is blind? Well, they're clearly going to need a completely different information delivery system than just text, right? What are we going to do? It's worth having that conversation with everybody, because everyone consumes information differently. So I know I'm being a little bit general, but I think I'm reflecting on the fact that this is a problem that will never go away, or a challenge that will never go away, and it is the board's and management's responsibility to say out loud, look, this is never going to be perfect, and it can be better. So what are we going to try that's a little bit better next time than what we did last time?
So I'd like to hear from you what your top 3 recommendations to nonprofit boards for things that they could implement right away would be. Are there any sort of quick wins that they could get just to do things better that may not be apparent to them?
Yeah, so a couple that we've talked about already, and another one. Well, I'll do the new one first, which is ask questions in advance of the meeting. So this is related to what we were just talking about. So let's imagine that I've created a board packet, and it's a couple hundred pages long. It's very detailed, and the board reads it, and everybody comes in prepared, and I make a presentation, and I say, does anybody have any questions? Usually what happens is someone has some really annoying question, or nobody has any questions. Well, wouldn't it be better if we asked the board a question in advance, something really cool, something inspiring, something provocative, something where as management, we actually want to know the answer, and give it to them a week before the board meeting. And after you've made the relevant presentation, instead of opening the door to silence or a conversation that we don't want to have, we say, hey, let's debrief the question that we've all had a week to think about. Nobody gets put on the spot, right? Everybody's had an opportunity to think about it. And we have directed the conversation in a way that we actually are excited to engage, right? So the board in this way is serving management's purpose, which they really want to do. This does not preclude the board from asking whatever questions they want. Of course they can, but we've almost, not guaranteed, but we've increased the probability that the dialogue we're going to have is going to be more relevant, better thought through, and more useful to everybody, and everyone will feel engaged. The other one, which I mentioned before, is I really think that boards and senior executives together at several stages during the exploration of a consequential decision should be openly asking the question about which stakeholders are going to be affected by this decision, or stand to be affected positively or negatively, which ones will be affected positively, which ones will be affected negatively, to whom do we feel like we owe the greatest duty in discharging this decision, so that not just to cover our butts legally speaking, but so that as we work through this decision, we've got a shared understanding of the impact that it's going to have on our community and the stakeholders around us, and a clarity of, if we're going to, once we make this decision, if there are some stakeholders that are affected badly, we've done this not on purpose. I'm not saying we're purposely hurting anybody, but we've done it with our eyes wide open, and we still feel confident that we're all behind the decision. This is not going to surprise us. I think that's a really, really important piece. And I was I was going to say something completely different, but I've changed my mind, because I want to reiterate what I think is maybe the most important point, which is, if you don't have a shared understanding of what good governance is, you are almost guaranteed not to achieve it. And again, I'm going to reiterate my definition just because it's useful to have one. if good governance is intentionally cultivating effective conditions for making decisions, then that gives us a set of questions we can ask ourselves about every bit of what we're doing. It gives us direction that it is not compliance oriented. It's not nuts and bolts or in the weeds. It's about how are we going to optimize ourselves. And if you don't like that definition, that's fine, but say it out loud in your next board meeting. What I don't know what good governance is, or here's what I think good governance is. What do you guys think? And do it confidently, because it seems, as I said before, it might seem patronizing, but to me, if you can't articulate what that is, then you're almost just hoping that you're going to get it right. And I don't think hope's going to get us there, especially given the challenges that we talked about at the beginning of our conversation.
And finally, I just wanted to end with asking your advice on what kind of resources that you could recommend that can help boards of directors gain additional tools and develop stronger governance skills, other than your marvelous podcast, which I'm delighted to hear about, and I'll be listening and following it closely going forward.
Yeah, thank you. And because you plugged my podcast, I'll be clear that the reason why I recommend it is not just as an educational tool, but because it's so short. It's 60 to 90 seconds per episode, that if you scroll through the 150 odd episodes that are there, you're probably going to find something that is at least slightly relevant to something you want to do in your next board meeting. And just sticking in a 60 or 90-second thing in your pre-work for the board meeting can help to bring a little bit of a different perspective in the room. So that is one thing. But the other advantage to reframing governance around decision making is, if I don't know if you probably haven't, because you're not a nerd like me, but if you look up on Google Scholar or similar for academic papers on corporate governance, they are really boring. They don't typically focus on questions that are relevant to anybody. And this is my editorializing, I don't even think that the results are all that good. So instead of thinking about corporate governance in the academic sense, if we now think of it as decision making, the science around the way that individuals and groups of people make decisions together is really robust. It happens to be really interesting, unlike the science around corporate governance. And it's been translated by tons of really smart people into really fun books. So, I'm thinking about the Katie Milkmans of the world, or the Adam Grants of the world, and so on. Like, just look up books on decision making, and there's tons of them. One of my favorites is Decisive by Chip and Dan Heath. You can get the chapter 1 of that book for free on their website, and I assign that as pre-reads to my clients all the time. I love it. So if you just sort of shift your thinking away from that sort of compliance oriented side of corporate governance, and instead say, what are the resources that I can find that will help me walk in the room better equipped to make decisions with my peers? Oh, there's so many good resources. And I'm going to actually, because it's on my shelf, I know this is weird. My favorite management book in the world is called Thing Explainer by Randall Munroe. I've gifted this to many, many, many CEOs, and I'll describe it really quickly. I'll open a page because the video is going to be there. But what he does is he takes, every page is a like blueprint style illustration of some very complex thing, like the International Space Station, and it's described in great detail using only the 1,000 most common words in the English language. And so the International Space Station is called Shared Space House because international and station are not among the most common words in the English language. And in one page, you learn, without having to learn any new words, you learn how the International Space Station works and what it's for, how a nuclear reactor works and what it's for, and so on and so on and so on. And I give this to CEOs because I say, look, I know it's hard to communicate complex things in simple ways. It's really hard. And this is part of what creates the information asymmetry between you and the board. You're eating and sleeping and breathing the organization. They're coming in once every few months and hoping to get it. But Randall Munroe can explain how a nuclear reactor works in one page with no complex words, then you can explain your stuff.
Well, Matt, you forgot the e-learning course that you created and developed for Charity Village that we're proud to have as part of our collection on better boards, and are very grateful for your expertise and assistance in creating that. Matt, it was so interesting talking to you about these really important issues, and it certainly has informed my thinking about the work that I do on my nonprofit board. So I really appreciate it, and I think it'll be fascinating for our audience. So thanks so much for sharing your expertise and advice on Charity Village Connects.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.